Okay, we are going to get started and just want to let you know a couple of logistical things before we jump into our program. First of all, welcome. Hello, thank you for being here with us for this important topic. My name is Brenda Leaks and I am the head of school at Seattle Girls School. And we're going to spend the next hour talking about how to have conversations with your kids about race and racism. So in terms of a few logistics, you will see that when you go into the chat, your chat will come only to the panelists. Really today, we want you to focus on, listening and learning, and we want to know if something's happening for you in terms of audio or issues with the video or the visuals or things like that. So please jump into the chat to let us know if you're having any challenges with audio or anything like that. If you'd like to pose a question, we ask you to put that in the Q&A. And we have a couple of folks in the Q&A who are going to try to answer questions as we go along, or if they know that we're going to be addressing those things later on, they'll let you know that you can expect to hear them later on in our program. And then to the extent that we'll have time, we're going to try to get to some of the Q&A. We did have over 80 questions come through with the pre-registration, and so we're going to attempt to address as many of those as we can. Many of those questions were about our program overall, our theme around how to talk to kids about race and racism. And so we feel like we will address many of those questions as we go along. And those that we don't have a chance to address, we're going to be thinking about sharing resources and thinking about how we can provide another opportunity to share those questions with you all. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you all can see all of our fabulous panelists. My name is Brenda Leaks, and I'm head of school here at Seattle Girls School. I'm here today for a variety of reasons. I am a Black mother, I am a Black woman, a Black sister, a Black daughter. And so these issues all have meaning to me from a personal level as I think about my life and the life of my son and of all the people in my family. I'm also a Black educator, and I feel called and charged with having conversations about race and racism, which are hard to do and messy, even in the best scenarios in schools, so that the role of education is not just about empowering kids to go off and live a great life and have a great career, but to be people who contribute to the betterment of society and the world for everyone. And in order for us to do that, we have to be thinking about how our students are equipped to position themselves to make the world better for people who are marginalized. And that's why, that's a big part of the reason why I'm here and why this conversation matters so much to me personally. You're going to hear our presenters share that, who they are and why they're here, what brought them to this conversation, what skin they have in this game. But I want to let you know what the hour is going to look like. After our introductions, we will start by addressing the key question, which is what is appropriate when you're talking to your kids about race and racism from a developmental perspective. And then we are going to move into conversations and suggestions around how to deepen the conversation between parents and their children, regardless of their race, okay? We will try to answer as many questions as we can through those, and then we'll take a moment to see what's in the Q&A to see what we can address there. And then we're gonna end with some hope and action. We do not want you to leave this conversation feeling heavy. We want you to leave this conversation feeling informed and also feeling empowered to go forward and have these conversations with your kids and in the classrooms. We know there are a lot of educators here with us today. So with that said, I'm going to invite our first panelist, Janine Jones, to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Janine Jones. I'm a licensed child psychologist and a professor and director of the school psychology program at the University of Washington. And my skin in the game is basically like Brenda, my skin and my life experience that has shaped how I am as a psychologist, how I am as a mother, as a wife, and the way that I move through my spaces. I was in private practice for 14 years and worked with predominantly African-American families in the first probably 8 years of my practice. And most of the reason why that my practice grew like that is because families were looking for someone who could help them support their kids in terms of dealing with race and identity and the stress of being in a community, excuse me, where they're one of few. And I happen to also have lived a life where I was one of the few African Americans in predominantly white spaces. So it just was a natural fit for me to take on clients like that. And I also work at the University of Washington, which is a predominantly white space, and have students that I'm trying to shift our program to be more racially diverse, and also prepare our students to work with kids of color. And so for me, everything that I do, it's really wrapped around identity and belonging and culture, and how to incorporate it in everything that I do. So that's why I'm here.
Am I next?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I'm
Carolyn.
sorry. So I'm Carolyn Carlson, and I want to thank Brenda for inviting me today. Obviously, I am not an educator, but a psychotherapist here in Seattle in private practice. My skin in the game, which I loved your question, perfect question, is that as I've evolved from the first time someone told me I was racist, and I was like, what? I didn't even know. And as a white woman over the last 20 years, my commitment has been to elevate people of color and their voices, to take the burden off, and to really work with white people to dismantle and heal and curate and just really dismantle racism, white supremacy within us so that we can do that work. And I do that a huge part through my practice. I also, as someone who parented an 8th grader who just graduated, class of 2020, that I love working with parents around how to work with white children and actually believe and trust in their resiliency. So that is my deep commitment, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rosetta Lee, and I am a founding faculty member at Seattle Girls School. And part of the time I teach middle school science, and part of the time I'm tooling around locally, regionally, and nationally, doing trainings around diversity, inclusion, equity, and cultural competency. And for me, the skin in the game is I'm at Seattle Girls School because of its anti-bias mission. For so long, I've been aware of the fact that educational spaces can be either tools for liberation or tools for indoctrinating children into fitting into a society that may or may not love them. And so for me, I have always seen education as a liberatory space, and I was excited to work at a school that didn't tell me this has nothing to do with science, right? And you gotta teach, concentrate on the content rather than the people. And I've always thought the content is the vehicle through which I teach young people how to be who they are. And so to be at a school where I am given support and freedom to do that, and then to be given support and freedom to actually go out there in the larger community to help, especially schools, see that this is possible, if not imperative. And so that's my skin in the game, and I'm really excited to be here with you. All right. So oftentimes the initial question is race. It just seems like a really complex issue. I don't know what's appropriate. My child is only. And I just wanted to highlight this resource, which will be available on the website that we're going to post. But the reality is everything in the research has shown that starting 3 months of age, we start seeing evidence of babies noticing race and actually starting to internalize bias. This chart only goes up until 6. Okay, and so I invite you to check it out. The Children's Community School in Philadelphia has done some phenomenal work around collating the research to say they're not too young. Okay, now at the same time, there are other questions that arise. So I want to transition to the next slide and then talk to you about what are some of those early markers. So what is developmentally appropriate, right? So we know that as early as 3 months, but definitely by 6 months, they can discern racial feature differences. They don't have the concept of race yet, but they certainly notice things like skin color, nose, lips, hair texture, etc. We know from studies where they measure gaze times, because preverbal children will stare at things longer or shorter depending on familiarity or difference. And clearly there are different patterns around racial groups. By 10 months of age, they're even starting to show preference, right? And so if people of different racial groups hold out the exact same toy, they will reach out to in-group racial members. And this is not because they're little bigots, it's because it's an evolutionary thing, right? The closer you look like to me, the more likely we're genetically related, and we are hardwired for in-group bias, right? And the closer you look like to my caregiver, you're more likely to feed me, take care of me, protect me. It is a natural wiring that we have, but it doesn't have to stay this way. By 3 years of age, they're beginning to even pick up on this idea of gender and gender roles. So any kind of messages that are consistent enough, they're starting to figure out the rules of what's okay and what's not okay, right? By 5 years old, this is a really crucial time because this is a time when they are categorizing. They want to categorize themselves, they want to categorize others. And this is the time when they are asking a lot of questions. They want to know what things are called. They're noticing those differences. They want to know what it's called. Is it good? Is it bad? What do you think? And what I find interesting is, though this is a really natural instinct that kids have, oftentimes adults will satisfy their curiosity about everything except human difference, right? Mm-hmm. So a child says, what is a square? And we will say, it's a shape with 4 sides. The child will say, what is pink? And we will say, it's a color between white and red. And then they will say, why is that person's skin darker than mine? And we will say, shh, right? And that communicates a couple of things to children. One, talking about difference is not okay. It's not a good thing to do. It's a shameful thing to do, etc. And then we communicate a second thing, which is children start to pick up on this notion of the adults in my life will not teach me about this, so I have to figure it out on my own. And sadly, they figure it out through things like who comes over to my house and who doesn't, who is in my neighborhood and who isn't, who is featured in the children's books that I'm shown and who isn't, who is on TV and who is not, who is like always talked about as famous or powerful or good looking and who is not. And so by 5 years old, most children actually have a pretty strong racial bias. So you can give 5-year-olds, and you can do this in any area, like conservative, liberal, diverse, homogenous. If you give a 5-year-old an identical cartoon strip with an identical cartoon little girl, she's identical in every single way except for skin tone. You ask a 5-year-old to point to the girl who is nice and the girl who is mean, the girl who is good at school and the girl who is not good at school. And many children will point to the lighter skin tone child as having positive attributes and the darker skin tone child as having negative attributes. This sometimes even occurs in children of color. That's how widespread the message is. And here's the kicker, folks. When the 5-year-olds are asked, what do you think your teachers think is the good girl and the bad girl, right? What do you think your parents think? Most 5-year-olds believe the adults believe the same things they do, okay? By 7 years old, though, they are starting to recognize that there are certain things you're supposed to say and not supposed to say. So they start to regulate their biases versus their behaviors in speech, right? And so, but at the same time, you can tell what kind of messages they were raised with by the way they talk to each other, right? So a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old in the same room, the 5-year-old's just gonna blurt out whatever they think, right? Maybe a child will say, boys are just better than girls, right? The 7-year-old might correct the 5-year-old, but how they correct the 5-year-old is really fascinating. Some 7-year-olds will correct the 5-year-old by saying, well, some girls are better than some boys at some things, and some boys are better than some girls at some things, and you just can't say boys are better than girls. That's not right, and that's not fair, and it's mean, right? Some 7-year-olds will interrupt the 5-year-old by saying, shh, like grown-ups don't like it when we talk like that. Okay, so I often think about what is the internalized message that they are starting to regulate their biases with. By 3rd grade, they're aware of most societal stereotypes. They may not believe them, they may not have internalized them, but they know they're there, right? I've done stereotype workshops with kids, and they can name a lot of societal stereotypes. Like one stereotype workshop that I did, a child was like, there are actually stereotypes around countries and continents. I'm like, well, tell me more. And this child was like, well, we think, you know, all people in Africa are poor, and that all people in Asia eat sushi, and that all Canadians are nice, right? And then another child jumps in and says, you know, don't forget about accents, right? We think French and English accents are fancy, and we think Chinese and Spanish accents are not fancy. Okay, they're picking it up, folks. They don't necessarily believe them, thankfully, but they're there. Sadly, by 5th grade, they're starting to internalize them, okay? And we know they're starting to internalize them because research around things like stereotype threat. If you belong to a group where there's a stereotype about your group, and you get into a situation where you might prove the stereotype true, there's a part of you that's worried about that, even at a subconscious level, that you actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the reality is, if you remind girls of their girlness before a math test, they will score statistically lower than if you don't remind them of gender, right? And that phenomenon starts to happen at a statistically significant level starting 5th grade. So oftentimes the folk wisdom has been, we need to protect their innocence so that they can remain open-minded and not bring up these conversations. Well, the research is implying that if we want to maintain their innocence and open-mindedness, we actually have to have the conversations early and often, right? Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Some of you are like, but my child is like 4. How do I have that conversation? The reality is, when they're very young, they're just trying to understand the world, and we have to help them understand. So oftentimes they're going to ask curiosity-based questions about difference. They're going to blurt out whatever there is their current understanding of the world. And our job is I like to take a 3-step approach, right? First, find out what they're actually talking about. Because sometimes we listen with our adult ears, but that is not what they're talking about at all, right? As a sex educator, I know that when they're asking, where did the little brother come from? Sometimes they're asking, what hospital were they born in? Not, tell me about the birds and the bees, right? And so, a classic example of this, a kindergarten teacher told me a little boy approached her and said, Miss So-and-so, your butt is really hot. And she's like, oh my gosh, where's this coming from? Thankfully, she paused and asked a lot of questions. What had happened was he had sat in our chair, which is in the direct sunlight for hours. So the seat was super warm. So he was making a temperature observation. And I think it's actually a pretty good observation that maybe the seat was hot because the teacher's bottom is warm. It had nothing to do with like sexism, right? And then the second thing is, I like to find out why they're asking it or why they're saying it, right? When a child is like, I wish I wish I were prettier, or I wish I was white. I'm like, okay, well, when did you start thinking that? Why do you think that? And finding out the whys can help us. What are those influences? Maybe a child got bullied. Maybe they're right now being shown only positive, affirming images or curricula of light-skinned people. And so they're starting to absorb this thing. The finding out why gives you some idea of what the intervention might be. The third piece is, when you talk to them, answer the question or respond straightforwardly. Kids pick up on our anxiety because we're hand-wringing, or we are emotionally flooded and we yell at them. So fake it if you need to, but have a straightforward conversation with them. And my thing is this: treat conversations with the young people like they're adorable depositions. Like, answer just the question being asked. Don't, no more, no less. Don't launch into a 3-hour after-school special, right? So the conversation I had with my nephew when he was about 5 is, he asked, was that an emo? Emo's the word for auntie. Why do people have different skin colors, right? I'm a science teacher, so I go scientific first, right? I'm like, there's this stuff in your skin. It's called melanin. And the more you have, the darker you are, and the less you have, the lighter you are. We all have different amounts of melanin, just like we're all different heights. So that's why we have different skin colors. And he's like, but why? I'm like, well, there are some places in the world where it's like sunny and hot all the time. And it turns out melanin is sort of like built-in sunscreen. You know how on a sunny day you have to put on sunscreen so you don't get sunburn? So imagine in those places, people had so much melanin because it's just a good idea to have tons of it built into your skin, don't you think? So people who come from those regions have very, very dark skin. And then other areas, there's hardly any sun. And in fact, you kind of need to be exposed to the sun a little to be healthy. So in those places, people developed hardly any melanin. And so they ended up very, very pale, okay? And then he goes, but we all live here now. Why do we still have different colors? And I'm like, oh, this kid. Okay, so you know how your eyes kind of look like your mommy's and your chin kind of looks like your daddy's? He's like, yeah. Well, we get our looks, our physical looks, from our biological parents. So we don't need different amounts of sunscreen, but that's what we get because it's one of those look things that we get from our biological parents. And then there's a long pause, and I think we're done with this conversation, but he looks worried. He's like, is it okay that we have different amounts of sunscreen, right? Because now it's like a health and safety question, right? I'm like, oh yeah, totally fine. It's okay that we have different amounts of built-in sunscreen, because if you need more sunscreen, put some on, right? If you need more sun, go outside and play. We have hats and air conditioning and boats and airplanes. Anybody can live anywhere and be healthy, okay? And I like wanted to wrap it up with like a inclusive message. So I'm like, which is great, because now we can live in the same neighborhood and have all of these beautiful skin colors. You know how like kids stop listening and you can tell? So he got his curiosity answered. He's like, okay, I'm gonna go play now, right? But ultimately, all of our conversations have been like this. If we answer honestly and we answer factually and we help them unpack the world, this is how we develop resilient young people who can, because he started to ask more complex questions too, right? Why is it that on the cartoons, all the darker skinned people are always the evil characters? Like that is questions about racism that started to happen at seven years old. So it's that idea of make the conversation a regular thing. And it's a 101-minute conversations, not one 100-minute conversation, right? And then model and coach, because honestly, the best way we teach is thinking about, again, who do you invite into your home? Who do you look comfortable with and connected to? What areas of the city do you go into? Which ones do you avoid? When you encounter something new, how do you like approach that with curiosity and humility rather than judgment? All of those things will be tiny little conversations that stick. And the final piece is this: be mindful of children's media, because it's not always good for kids. A lot of research actually implies that children's media, the children who engage more in children's media actually show more relationally aggressive and exclusive behavior than children who engage in adult media. So like 30 minutes of SpongeBob makes your kids meaner than 30 minutes of watching Friends, okay? Sibling pairs that read the Berenstain Bear series are actually meaner to each other than sibling pairs that don't, okay? And this is not about getting rid of books. It's actually paying attention to the fact that children's media really highlights the things that are most important to kids, right? Which is kindness and friendship and inclusion, right? And so if you want to create conflict, you often demonstrate unkindness, unfairness, exclusion, and bullying. And if you want to sustain the drama, you show a lot of it. So a lot of children's media, the balance between pro-social modeling and anti-social modeling, there's a lot more anti-social modeling that's happening than pro-social. And the other piece is this: especially young children can't follow the plot. You think you just read them a story of how this is a mean thing that happened, and here was the comeuppance and how everybody learned and got better. They're not following the plot. So they don't realize that this was bad and this is good. They're just like, this is how young people treat each other, right? And so for me, it's about being mindful of that balance in children's media, and then as much as possible engaging with them so that you can help them unpack what is okay and what is not okay. When I'm especially working with young children, I like to stop. You know, if the book says, and they said, you can't play with us, I just stop and go, that was not kind. That was not a good thing to do. What would you do? What would our school do? What would a kind person do? So that they can actually get a point counterpoint lesson right away, instead of having to cognitively hold that storyline for the whole time. So the idea is it's possible. It's a little scary, but it's actually kind of fun after a while. And so I hope that those of you who are anxious about talking to young kids, do so. And so I'm going to pass it off.
Yeah. Thank you, Rosetta. And I think the power of that message around kids receive these messages from society, from all the things, and from our behavior as parents and adults, it really brings home the imperative for us to engage with them. Listening to you made me think about when I was in kindergarten, and I was, so I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I came home and I put that yellow towel on my hair and I started swinging it around, because there were, all the yellow haired little girls that they had the pretty hair. It took me a really long time to learn that I had pretty hair too. And I think, the ways in which we have those conversations with our kids help them to be able to understand that, both for kids who are, who are white, and for kids who are kids of color as well. And so we're going to transition to talking about how do you deepen those conversations with your kids, you know, based on your race and their race. And so Janine's going to start us off by sharing how to deepen those conversations for parents of color talking to their kids of color.
Thank you. Yeah, Rosetta's introduction and description of developmental processes are tied perfectly to what I'm just about to describe here. I'm coming from the perspective, I'm going to talk about parents of color with their children that are children of color, and they're the ones having the experience of, much like Rosetta's description, where, was that your nephew, Rosetta?
Yes.
Yeah, so to her nephew's asking questions, it might be that your own child comes home and says, why is it everybody wants to touch my hair? And why do they laugh that my hair doesn't do what their hair does, or things like that? And so parents of children of color have to do a process called racial socialization. And this begins really early and it lasts all the way until adulthood. So it's not one of these very short phases of life. And so I'm going to talk about it in 3 buckets. Safety is the first bucket that I want to talk about. And the safety bucket is really to be thinking about, how do we make our kids feel safe in their home environments and in the world? And we start with things like talking to our children about embracing that difference is a good thing and that there's beauty in difference. Because there has long been bias on skin tone, there's more racism for people with darker skin tones than lighter skin tones. I have a lot of friends that intentionally make comments about, I'm darker than you, and play with their kids around that to make them feel like dark. It's the counter narrative to the skin bias. And so embracing difference as a good thing. Allowing conformity, I can say I did the same thing that Brenda did when I was 5 years old with the towel on the head. And I also told my mother that I wanted to change my name to Tiffany. I was in an all-white school. My sister and I were the only African-American kids in the entire school. And I had this desire to conform. So that was part of what that desire to change my name and to wear the towel and skip around the house was. And my mom was horrified. And then at the same time, she had to understand that that was natural because I needed to be feeling like I was belonged at the school and I needed to feel connected to people, especially being from a culture of people that are collectivistic and see themselves as one of many, not as an individual. So allowing conformity, knowing that that will change, but don't resist it. Don't push against it and say absolutely not. Teaching about bias, implicit bias, as kids get older, if we don't identify what implicit bias is, oftentimes kids will personalize and think it's something wrong with them, as kids of color particularly. So they'll think there's something wrong with them and they will not talk about it. And so there's not room for them to have language or words to kind of connect to why it felt funny when somebody assumed something about them. Same with microaggressions. So you heard Rosetta speak about microaggressions. These are the ways in which people deliver their bias typically to kids of color. So they will communicate things that suggest that they have a biased impression and they make assumptions, and the child in response will look at that and think, well, was that about me, or did they really mean that? Or they're wondering and they get into this place of confusion. Once I can tell you, with my daughter, when we had our first conversation, which was way earlier than I planned to have, I'll just say, when we had our first conversations around bias and microaggressions, once I said the word, I've heard her throughout her, probably since 8 years old, she's been able to label things as microaggressions to people as well as with us. And that was important to know that she could do that because it gives her like a container, something to put it in. So she, to this day, we just talked about microaggressions that happen in different contexts that she brought up, and she's 16 now. And then establishing norms and communicating what, and that should say values with an S, meaning communicating the values of your family, articulating them out loud. There's going to be ones like, you know, that look that moms give to their kids that say, you better stop what you're doing. That one you don't really necessarily articulate, but for the most part, communicate what's important to the family and value. Those are things that are part of safety. If anybody's seen, there's a video of a beautiful African-American boy he's probably maybe 16, 17, and he's on Instagram and he's talking about the ways in which his mother socialized him to deal with police. And it's one of these things like, that's the talk everybody's referring to right now, but it also is part of racial socialization. And so just know that that's communicating norms of behavior that are appropriate in different contexts, and they require having to think about and talk about it in terms of your racial identity. So the next bucket is buffering and supporting, because it is absolutely inevitable that a child of color will face bias and deal with microaggressions, and they also need the skills to be able to cope with that. So if you're setting this foundation of safety where it's identifying and labeling and externalizing things from within, then this is the place where you're spending time trying to help them understand how to cope with it and how to understand what this context is that they're in. So normalizing confusion, when we often in psychology, we refer to things like dissonance. And that is that when a child wants to conform and they attempt to conform, and then they get kind of hit a brick wall and it says, you can't, you are not going to be able to fit in with us, even if you tried, then they get into this state of dissonance and confusion. And so when that happens, you want to normalize that and say, that's really, that's how it goes. And so we have to just understand that being in that state of confusion is temporary, and you still can fit in. It's just, you're fitting in a different way. And remember, difference is beautiful. So kind of reframing as positive. The next I have there is building community and elder connections. And so particularly with African-American youth, it seems like this is one of these really key ways that African-American youth can see their heritage and see the resilience in their elders, and and learn to show respect for older people. And so my daughter was a Seattle Girls School student, and I had to make my own cultural adjustments when she was referring to some teachers by their first name, because I can't do that. Like, I'm 50 and I can't do that with people that are perceived as elders in my community. So I'm like Mr. Miss. And so I had to make that adjustment. And so part of it, that's what she was living before we got to the school. And then we just and I said, well, can you call her Miss Wendy? But that community connection is critical, because it's creating a network of social support and people to go to when you don't understand what's happening. Creating counter narratives, that ties into the concept that Rosetta mentioned about stereotype threat, that there are pre-existing stereotypes, and now you already heard by 5 years old, they're already getting established, even though they may or may not make sense. For a child who may be the recipient of a stereotype, you want to keep infusing counter narratives, or the opposite, and showing examples of how that's not true, because that needs to play in their head at the time they have a stereotype or a bias inflicted upon them. They need to be able to generate, nope, that's not me. I am not an exception to the rule. I am just like a whole lot of other people. So that is not me. Being able to push back and reject that. And buffering also includes encouraging emotion. So a lot of families will try and do the make you feel better kind of thing. So if your child upset and the first thing you want to do is make them feel better and kind of take the emotion away, that's actually not the best way to handle that, because as you, if you are squashing emotions, kind of imagine it like you're pressing them down into the body and those are being contained. And then as they continuously have these negative emotions, they're just getting contained contained and suppressed in the same over and over again. It's just getting bigger and bigger. So with families, I talk about a teapot and how when you put a teapot on the stove and you turn up the water starts to boil and it gets so much pressure inside that all of a sudden it has to be released. Same with emotion, that if kids are kind of taught to suppress their feelings and not talk about them or put them in in a space where they take them out of their bodies, it's going to come out, and typically it'll come out in aggression or anger or tantruming, depending upon their age. So giving them the voice and the vocabulary to really express emotion is really important part of buffering and protecting. And then here you're maintaining those cultural values, giving continuous examples of how the values fit into new contexts as they're presented. And then the last section here is about a concept that we refer to as racial identity. So every kid or adolescent is developing their identities. However, kids of color are also developing a racial identity. And the racial identity is in the context of who they are, because remember, if every biased situation or dealing with microaggressions are all typically attached to race, then they have to know that that's a part of who they are, and you have to, in tandem, to help them develop that. So here's some components here, and I'll just quickly go through these. That teaching self-love and compassion for yourself and who you are, what you look like, and the spaces that you're in, putting the child in spaces that will build that and reinforce it. Knowing cultural heritage, you got to look back to be able to go forward. And so to know what you hear people talk about, I'm standing on the shoulders of my ancestors. What did they do? What hardships did they experience and get through so that you can be where you are today? I have this shirt on right now that says, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, because that's a way that I remind myself that of my heritage and where I am is not because of me alone. It's because of everybody who sacrificed and experienced harm before me. Dreaming beyond the ancestors, that's what they wanted us to do, is they want us to everybody wants their child to do better than they did in the future. And some racial minority groups are less likely to have those outcomes realized because there's all these institutional things that get in the way. And so encouraging the dreaming and showing as those glimmers of light appear and the dreams are starting to be fulfilled, reminding them of that. Empowering youth who externalize devaluation. So what I was just describing earlier is, feeling devalued by other people. If you can externalize it and push it out and say, you know what, this is about their bias. This is not about who I am as a person. That is a part of a healthier racial identity. And it's hard to do. It's super hard to do, especially for adolescents. They have to get there, and it's like a muscle. You've got to exercise and practice, because the first thing that we typically do is internalize. And then last, kids with positive racial identity, they are very confident and they are very flexible. So those are the kiddos that are really good at code switching. They can move from one context of people to another context of people, communicate fluidly, and be really comfortable. So all of these things together, these are things that for a parent of color, a conversation that is repeated over and over again with their youth of color as they are growing. So I'd say starts early and all the way until they are no longer in your household.
Thank you, Janine. And I was also, as you were talking and thinking about all those, thinking about what Rosetta said earlier around not having one, hour-long conversation, but like lots of small conversations. And thinking about just a couple of weeks ago, a moment with my son, our first social distance play date was, him and 3 of his friends in different squares in a park with buckets of water and super soakers. And, I just was casual, like, do you know the person who invented the super soaker is a Black man? What? Oh my God. Right. He loves the super soaker, and knowing that, like, it provided a buoy that, like, it was amazing to see in that moment his pride in recognizing that that had been invented by a Black man. And so, I think even those things that you laid out in that spectrum are things that we can do in small pieces and let them guide us, even as we intentionally insert some of that information for them. The time goes fast. And we want to take just a couple of minutes each for Rosetta and then Carolyn to talk about how we have these same kind of conversations. Rosetta is going to talk about deepening that conversation as a white parent, having a conversation with your multiracial or biracial children. Rosetta?
Yes. And so when it comes to, let's say you're a white person raising a child of color, ultimately all of those things that Janine described, you are trying to instill those things or be a part of that journey. And I often think about the importance of recognizing you need to go on your own white racial identity journey and pay attention to the fact that the child is going through a different journey. And that is a reality, and that's okay. What you can do is actually start modeling for them. What does it mean to have a white ally and accomplice, somebody who sees you and loves you, right? And also is aware of racial injustice and is able to take action. If they can start recognizing that in white people, or start to recognize who are the folks who will harm me and who are the folks who will see me as whole and protect me and stand by me, that is actually a really important role. I also think about the importance of sometimes that's not your job. Just know that actually sometimes they need to be taught certain things by somebody who looks like them, by somebody who is going through the experience, because you can love them and you can empathize with them, but ultimately you don't have that same experience. I think the most important thing is believe them, believe their reality. And you may have some little experiences of microaggression, let's say when you go out as a family, right? And you have all of these like different races, and your status as a family or a legitimate family or an okay family, you may experience some of that. But the reality is, you as a white person with white skin privilege have plenty of spaces where you don't have to deal with that. Your child is actually experiencing this 24/7. So just because you can like shake it off and blow it off and say it doesn't bother me does not mean children can, right? So it's really important to do things like support them, listen to them, believe them, give them that emotional release and things like that. And the final piece is this, don't use your child as a shortcut to your own racial identity. I think there are times when young people have a really tense relationship, young people of color have a tense relationship with their white parents, because instead of doing their own work as a white person, it becomes, well, I have a multiracial child, or I have a Black presenting child, or whatever that may be, to not examine things like internalize, bias or microaggressions that you're perpetrating. That becomes like sort of like the past. And it's really important that, again, they're able to see you as a partner and somebody who can learn and grow with them and alongside them, and not just that they become like this badge of honor for racial equality.
Thank you, Rosetta. Carolyn, can you speak to how to deepen the conversation if you're a white parent talking to your white children?
Yes, and I appreciate going right after Rosetta with this, because I think moving into being a white person and a white person who's parenting white children, that I just, first of all, want to say it's very, very hard to do for our children what has not been done for us. And so this consciousness raising that white people are being called yet again, this is not the first call. It's happened many, many times. I think this call is worthy of a response from us as white people. And as parents, I obviously am not an educator, which is why I do not have a slideshow. So I love that I swim in the difficult feelings all day in what I do. And when I'm working with white parents, and as someone who's dismantling every day my own racism, white supremacy, institutional oppression, that I believe white parents need to do that work for ourselves in order to then help our children through it. And that is a very painful thing to do. And that the dismantling and the honesty also then brings up anxiety, fear, guilt, avoidance, and denial, right? So if we are answering this call to dismantle this in ourselves by education, going to other white people with our emotions, doing the work that is so necessary, we then have to get the support to deal with all the feelings that come from this consciousness raising. Because what happens is this consciousness raises, and then white people become so overwhelmed that then there's the shutdown, right? And then the burden then transfers to people of color to then rise up again, yet again, and challenge us, right? So I do want to make a link to middle school. I love middle schoolers. 5th grade to 8th grade, 6th grade to 8th grade, it is an unreal time, physically, mentally, emotionally. And I do feel that what we're constantly asking them to do is try things that are hard, make mistakes, face the parts of yourself that you don't like, and quite frankly, we don't like at times, and try, right? Do it. Keep moving, keep moving. And that, I think, is what white people, white parents are being called to do right now, is actually face the parts of ourselves that we avoid in order to practice. And there's two components that I think have to go together too, is I actually believe that white children can be resilient and strong in this, and that I want to make sure that we do not transmit our transgenerational racism, institutional oppression, and all the anxiety and guilt to them, that it's actually our responsibility to stop it here. And certainly, most people, I'm almost 50, most people my age did not have parents doing this for us. So allow the process, right? Like allow this to happen. And there's so much self-education that has to happen. So the stark difference in listening to both of you, which is amazing, is parents of color with, children of color, you're all doing this really, really early. And most of us white people are really not becoming conscious that we're white and that we benefit from this until much later in life, until someone told me in college, like, oh, there's white supremacy. And right, and I had no idea, because the system requires me to be unconscious, right? So us doing this for our children is a big call. And I want us, even highly anxious children, I read through all the questions that were given to us today, which were lovely. And I just really want to validate the fear of doing it wrong. And so many of us white parents are just like, oh, but I want to do it right. And what I would say is that's also a social construct of whiteness, right? That you have to know exactly, you have to be perfect and superior and do it on point, instead of messing up every day and making mistakes, taking feedback. And so I think what I'm bringing, instead of the step-by-step for our children, is believing in their resiliency, doing the work ourselves, and then modeling that, our humbleness. If I have a friend of color who's really upset about what I said, I can share that with white children in my life and be like, oh God, I totally messed that up, right? And so I think that the way white children are going to learn is by us modeling that for them. And the final point, which a friend of mine said the other day, which I thought was so lovely, is that if I can take the burden off of people of color, and I can give the space and time for healing and repair and thriving, right? That to me is a parallel experience between me doing my own internal work for me and my ancestors and our children, right? And that those are related. They both have to happen. So that's what I'm bringing, and that for me is the work that I'm challenging white parents to do, because it's awesome. And I feel very hopeful, and I don't want us to go through this again. I don't want this burden yet again. So thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. What you just said makes me think about a norm that the faculty have at SGS that we call ouch, oops, snaps. And it's a moment where, there's a recognition that, we make mistakes. So there's an ouch, right? You said something that was insensitive or unthoughtful or misinformed or downright wrong and hurtful, whatever the context is. someone says, ouch, it's a moment for us to say, oops. And I think oftentimes, again, I loved how you said the system requires that white people be unconscious. I think, you know, it's hard for white people to say, oops. Rosetta, we don't have enough time for Rosetta to do this whole metaphor, but she has this metaphor about when you hit somebody, let's say you hit somebody with a car, you don't get out of the car, you get out of the car and you say, how are you? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. You don't get out of the car and say, why were you walking in the street? Like, or that close to the sidewalk, right? Which is, often feels like what the conversation, you know, because there's a natural tendency to be defensive when you're called out, or even if you're called in around like, hey, this happened and I need you to know that it had an impact on me. And so, even just starting from a place of, I'm going to sit with the emotion that my action has caused and not feel like I need to deny or defend or push off of that emotion. And I'm going to model that for my children. And I'm going to teach my children how to do that, because that is the reality of what being a white person and learning in this space looks like. There's a lot of ouch. And then there's a lot of you saying, oops, learning. And then, you know, us acknowledging your learning. That's what the snaps is, right? For in the SGS culture, ouch, oops. Okay, you're gonna learn from that. We're gonna move forward. So we're at 12:55, right? And I just want to acknowledge that this, and I know all of you who are here with us know that this is not. This was not intended to be the entirety of the conversation, right? It could not be within an hour. We wanted to offer this as an opportunity to begin to think about how you would have some change the conversations that you're having with your kids, and to think about things you could do to move forward. As we shared at the beginning, we are going to share the recording, the slide deck, as well as a lot of resources that have come our way that we think would be helpful for you all. We also are going to have a survey that goes out with all those resources, and invite you to share additional questions. If it would feel helpful, and if my panelists were willing, we could do another one of these to talk about something that was more specific, you know, or more in depth. So given that we're at 12:56, and I want to respect everyone's time, I'd love to ask each of our panelists to share maybe one or two things, 30 seconds of how, like, what is the next action from the seat you're sitting in as an educator, as a therapist, you know, or whatever lens you want to bring to that. What's something that folks can go and do next? Janine, how about you start, please?
So I'm thinking the counter narratives is a really good tool. So as you see, hear, or make a mistake and identify a stereotype with someone, to actually fix it in that moment, because we all have biases. So just as soon as that it comes out, then we're like, oh, wait, that sounded like a stereotype. So let me rewind. Let me rephrase that, and then come up with the counter narrative and model it for your children, so that they kind of see that, yeah, we all make mistakes, but we can fix them immediately.
Thank you. Rosetta?
For me, I'm taking an educator stance. And so I often think of my role as a teacher as in loco parentis, right? And so I think about, what am I teaching? How am I teaching it? Because ultimately, there are a lot of ways that we say this is appropriate, this is groomed, this is smart, this is all of these like standards, which actually is based on white culture. And so what are the ways that we are giving more freedom for excellence of all forms to show up, that don't demand that everyone conform to a narrow bandwidth, which may or may not feel natural to them. The other thing I think about is increasingly schools are doing more racial equity work, which I think is great, but it comes in the form of talking about all of the horrible things that have happened in the past. And I gotta tell you, when the narrative is told, the journey to racial justice is told as heroes and villains, or victims and villains even, right? Oftentimes that discovery, especially for white children who have never engaged in conversations about race before, is that they feel like this portrayal always makes me look like a bad person. And for the children of color, this portrayal makes it always seem like I'm helpless, or that I am easy to take advantage of or hurt, right? And I invite us to think about telling the story of racial change, or racial equity, that journey, which is not over yet. This is the other thing. We've got to stop telling it like it was a 3-day event, right? Like Rosa Parks said no, and then Martin Luther King marched, and then laws got changed. It ain't that, right? So this journey, which is not over yet, right? How is it actually filled with resistors and allies? Folks who actually fought every single step of the way, this marginalization, this subjugation, and expressed power and resilience. And who are the people who, even though they benefited, knew it was wrong and continue to fight alongside and on behalf of people of color, right? Because then children can have positive role models that they can aim to be, right? Like I would love parents to be like naming their children Peggy McIntosh Smith, right? So that they can actually see themselves as these positive agents in the story of race.
Yeah.
Thank you. Carolyn?
I know we just have a minute. I would ask, I think what would be a good next step for white people and white parents is to find out where you are in this and be okay with that and get support and help and use the momentum right now to get in where you are. If you've been doing this for 25 years, go deeper, get more allies, keep going. If you just heard the word white supremacy, then find out what it means. Even if you don't believe it, just get in. And I think anywhere people are entering, there is room and support and education. And so that's what I'm encouraging white people and white parents to do. Let's just start.
Yeah. And I will end, I know there were a lot of educators on the call and there were lots of questions about how to do this work specifically in schools. And I'll say to those educators, challenge your institutions from the seats that you're in. Share your stories, amplify the stories of kids of color in your community so that they get brought to the surface. And I would say for all parents and teachers to trust our kids. We have to trust our kids. I think that, if you're like, well, there's so many things I could do, what's the first thing? Maybe the first thing you do is just go ask your child what they know, what they've experienced, what they believe, what they've heard, what they think. Because as you've heard, if you've heard nothing else in this hour, you've heard that kids are internalizing all of these messages, intentional and unintentional. And so, even if you just start with, I'm learning and I know you're learning, I want us to do that together. I want to listen first. Share with me what you're hearing. You're going to be surprised by what your kids can tell you. And they can often guide you in moving those conversations forward. So with that, we're gonna wrap up. Thank you all so much for spending an hour with us. Thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate you all sharing your voice, your perspective on this issue. Thank you to all of our attendees and participants. Continue doing the work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.